The Prophet ﷺ worked very diligently to create a culture that was exclusive and specific for Muslims. Did not deny the Sahaba the cultures that they came from. They still were allowed to keep, their tribal names. فلان من الخوس والخزرج والأوس وفلان من بني فلان وفلان من بني أزد فلان من بني سعيد فلان من بني مناف كذا. He allowed them to keep their connection. That is your family tradition. That those tribes represents, their lineages, and not to separate you from that. But creating also within that a subculture, which should be the dominant culture, which is the culture of Islam. When the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Kuntu nahaytukum an ziyarat al-qubur." He said, I previously prevented you from visiting graves. He said, فَزُورُوهَا فَإِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُكُمْ الْآخِرَةِ وَذَكِّرُ تُذَكِّرُكُمُ الْمَوْتِ. He said, but now visit the graves. Visit the graves because they remind you of the hereafter, or they remind you of death. Why did the Prophet ﷺ prevent the Sahaba from visiting graves from the very beginning? Because they came from a culture of grave worship. And in order to separate them from that, he could not introduce them to something that already resembled their culture, because then they would not see any difference in Islam. Which is what we do with non-Muslims. A non-Muslim comes into Islam and we say, hey, yeah, you can have more than one wife in Islam. And he said, oh, really? I can have 4 wives. I had 4 girlfriends, but I can have 4 wives. We've now introduced them to a culture in Islam that resembles the culture that they came from. Therefore, they don't see a difference between what they knew from Jahiliyyah and what they are now experiencing in Islam. We haven't changed the culture. The culture is still the same. So the Prophet ﷺ was trying to separate. He said, I previously prevented you from visiting graves because you came from a culture of grave worship. And to come into Islam and allow you to go to the graves, right? Coming from a culture of grave worship and then allowing you to come into Islam and then go visit graves because they remind you of the hereafter, or they remind you of death. Although a noble goal, a noble objective, we still have not made a distinction between Islam and Kufr. Still have not made the distinction. You guys following me?